So we're going to practice using a third-party API and making a call to it in Python. We're actually going to be using the New York Times API as our example instead of Spotify or Genius. I'm hoping that you're going to be forced to go through it on your own, and that'll really help you learn how this process goes. But a lot of the takeaways are going to be similar to what we covered today. So usually every API is going to have some sort of developer site where they have their documentation and whatnot. And they'll have some sort of kind of get started or quick start guide. Now, I've done all this and I'm not going to go through each one. I think it's okay if you just follow along. But usually you're going to have to start by creating an account. So I can click that here and show you, you just fill out this form. And then you're going to have to sign into your account to kind of open your personal developer portal. And then finally, you're going to need to register a client or an app. So the reason for this is you're basically telling New York Times in this case that you have this new app and it's going to be making calls to their API. And they can be like, okay, cool. We're going to give you this secret token or authorization key. And we know that whenever you use that, it's coming from your app. If you have two apps, so say I have my school project in Flask and then I'm doing a side project in iOS, then those are two different clients that you have to register, which are going to use their own keys. So in this case, you can, when you're logged in, you could go to the top right and click apps and then click new app on the top right and then put in the name, the description, what APIs you want to enable and whatnot. And once it's created, you can actually open it up and it'll show you all the sorts of information you'll need. So your API keys, and I'm going to delete this client, so it's okay that you can see this, and other things. So that's the basic setup. You're going to have to do this in Spotify. You're going to have to do this in Genius as well. Now, next thing we want to know is what data do we want to fetch? What endpoints can we use? So for that, we can go to APIs and see all the documentation that shows what sorts of things you can get. The New York Times one is pretty cool. They have archives going all the way back to like 1851 if you want to see like different headlines over time. You can do article search for certain keywords, certain types of things you want to know. You can see like top stories, popular stories, all sorts of stuff. So there's a very rich data set that you can work with. And you can see how this could be cool for like a personal project if you want to see like a data visualization of how headlines are changing over the course of decades or something like that. But for now, I'm going to stick with the article search API, and we're going to test this one out. When you go to the documentation, you get a few things. One are like, what is the endpoint? So after the slash, the path here for article search is article search.json. And then you're going to have like some different query parameters and stuff that you use to refine your search. And they'll show examples, like here's an example URL that you call with your API key, which is going to be really crucial in order to get your data. And then there's a ton of stuff. If I click paths, you can see even more. So you can see specifically what's the request URL, what are the query parameters you add on, like what are their formats and names, as well as in your actual response in the data you get back, what are the different fields that you can parse through to get what you want. So they have like the types, this is an array, this is an object, this is a string. And something cool you can do, even in Spotify and Genius both, are actually test out the API on your browser itself. So you don't need to use terminal or Python to just see that something's working. You can put in like parameters and your credentials and stuff here and execute the request here and see what sorts of data you're getting back. So this can be a really nice way to test it out before you get into the coding aspect. But again, I'm going to leave that up to you. And now I'm going to actually walk you through how to do a GET request in Python. So let's just start and make our file. So I'm going to call this nyt.py, and then I'm going to open it up, c9. And then, okay. And then a useful library that you can use actually, let's see, for some reason it froze up. That's okay. I just did Control-C. One library that is crucial is the requests library, and that allows you to fetch data from certain endpoints over the internet. So just make sure you have the requests library. You can do pip install requests. I have it already, so it kind of showed up already. Now I'm just going to reopen this because my Cloud9 was being a little buggy. And we start out by just simply importing requests. Request has two methods that are going to be useful for you. One is requests.post. That can be if you want to create some sort of resource. So in Spotify, you would need that if you want to create an access token that you can then use. And then there's requests.get, which is when you're actually fetching that sort of data that you want. And then the parameters that it's going to take are your URL. So what endpoint are you fetching at? And what's the full URL for it? And then some params. So we were talking about like query parameters that this endpoint had. You can put them here. And then sometimes you need headers, like in the case of Spotify or Genius. That's where you could put like a access token or something that you need in a certain format. So params and headers both are going to be like a dictionary with key value pairs. We don't actually need headers in the case of New York Times, so I'm going to remove that for now. And then I'm going to set request.get equal to a variable, just response here. Now, let's go back to the docs and figure out what our actual URL is. So my answer is actually pretty straightforward. It's right there front and center. You can copy paste this URL and then make it a string variable. So here's my URL. In some cases, you might need to sort of concatenate the string to add some stuff on it. So maybe you need to add a certain ID right here, and then like a slash, and then maybe second endpoint. So you can slowly build your URL up by doing this sort of string concatenation. In my case, there's no need for that. So this is just the basic URL that we're starting with. And then let's actually go to our example call. That can be really helpful. So this here was the URL. And then after the URL, there's going to be a question mark whenever we have some query parameters after that. So question mark is kind of signifying everything after this is going to be my query parameters. And they're just going to be key value pairs. So Q could be the key for this parameter, and then election would be the value. So we're saying, I want to know, I want to search up all the articles by the keyword election. And then the other one here, so we would add and for our next one is API key is whatever your key is. Now, building out this kind of logic where you have to add the equal sign and then the question mark and the Q and all of that sort of thing like this, that would take forever. And luckily, requests kind of can handle that sort of formatting for you if it knows what is what. So we're telling it that we're going to have some params. Like we said, the key for one of the params is Q. And then let's see, maybe we want to search up like GameStop articles and see what all the buzz is. So that could be our keyword, the value. And then of course you need your actual API key, which will authorize your request. So to find your key, you're going to go back here and I'm going to open up in the top right my apps. And then I'm going to open up my specific app here. And you have a key and a secret key. Depending on the query, you might need both or not. Here, it was just saying key. So I'm going to copy this guy, go back to my workspace, and then paste it here. So now we have our key set up, and query. This is probably not good code, so I'm going to actually make this a separate variable and set this here, and then make this separate variable and then set this here, because these things could change maybe. Now, very important thing to remember is this is really bad code. Don't do this. So we shouldn't be hard coding our API key in our actual Python file. And I'm going to show us how to get around that in our next demo. So for now, we're just going to let it slide. Okay, so we have our URL, we have our params, and that's it. Now let's test it. This is actually all we need. The only other thing we can do is, if you remember earlier, I was saying to make it easier to parse, you can use response, which is the variable .json. And that's going to allow you to use like an object notation to work through the data structure that is returned by the API. So we have that here. And then let's just print the data to make sure that something worked. Cool. This thing is spinning here. Let me just close it, reopen it. Okay, everything is good to go. How do we test this? Now, I usually stay away from the run button just because sometimes it can be buggy. And I think the better way to do it is just always run your command in the terminal and then see the output. So Python NYT.py, and it should be making this GET request and printing out the data. Let's test it out. And here we go. We got this huge blob of text, so much stuff going on. I can't even tell what's what because there's just so much. I do see a GameStop here. I see a couple GameStops, so I think it's working as expected. And that's good. The GameStop reckoning was a long time coming. There we go. And of course, we're going to use JSON parsing to get what we actually need. What if I tried this without the key? So maybe instead of key, I just said blah, blah. Now, this key is obviously wrong. What happens if I try to make the request anyway? So the response will actually say invalid API key. So you know that this is some legit authentication. Cool. Let me take away blah, blah. So we have this data. Now, next thing we want to do is actually parse it and make it readable and workable. Say we want to only return one specific piece of information to the UI. How can we do that? So if we go to the docs, if you remember, they actually told you the response types and kind of the field names. So here we have a map of how we can work with this huge data set and find what we need. So you have these original fields: status, copyright, response, basic stuff. Within response, there's docs, and that's going to be a list, an array of all the articles that it's found from the search. So this is the meat of what we're trying to get. So let's start by just going into response and then into docs. So I'm going to do print data and then brackets response, brackets docs. And then let's go back and see. So this is an array. It's probably going to have tons of articles in it. Let's just choose the first one. And then within that first one, we have this kind of article object, which we can parse through. So what's something interesting we could print out? You could see a snippet of the article. There's like some media. You can see the headline. So the headline could be interesting to see what's being kind of put at the top, the title. So why don't we do that? Why don't we go into the first item and then the headline, and then there's a bunch of things in the headline. Let's just do main to start with. It's probably the easiest. So after docs, I'm choosing the first in the array, and then I'm doing headline, then I'm doing main. And you just have to make sure you're following the structure exactly as it's returned. You might run into errors like, oh, key not found, because you're doing something in the wrong order or forgetting one level of the object. So now I'm going to run it again. And what should we expect? we should actually see the docs, the first one from them, and then the headline of it. Okay, I'm going to run the code. And then here we go. We get the GameStop rebellion. We know that our query is working, the endpoint is searching correctly, and we're getting back an article. Awesome. So what's next? What can we do further? One more thing that I can show you is just how to parse this in a more interesting way. So maybe I want to, instead of just showing the first one, I want to go through the first 20 articles, and I want to print out the headline for every single one. And then we can get kind of a richer idea of the articles that are being returned. Let's run this. All right, perfect. So GameStop rebellion, can anything stop GameStop? Reddit, the elites and the dream of GameStop to the moon. Now we're getting all this sort of stuff. It's saying list index out of range, so that probably means there weren't actually 20 articles, and a better way would have been to check the length first. But here we go. We have a basic API working with some dynamic data coming back.